Michael, let me ask you about the voter ID front, and I think we've had this conversation before. At some point, I understand that we still have roughly anywhere from 5 to 10%, particularly of older populations, without ID, right. Without a government-issued ID. That's going to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Are you going to be more open to voter ID laws?
I'm very open to voter ID laws if they're about kinds of ID that people actually have. And there are states where the kinds of ID required are very broad, or where there's a fail-safe if you don't have it. The problem, as you say, is that we estimate as many as 10% don't have it. And a lot of it is seniors, and a lot of it is more poor people. And that really goes to the tragedy of the whole thing.
But
we could make it so that everybody could vote.
They can still vote provisionally. I mean, they're still allowed to provisionally vote if they can come back and prove they're a legal voter.
But that means that a senior who is old and doesn't have their driver's license has to go back a second time, schlep themselves over to the government office, stand in line and prove who they are. That's not democracy, and that really isn't how we ought to be running elections. We could make this so easy. We could put everyone who's eligible's name on an electronic voter list, and that would add tens of millions of people to the rolls and guarantee that whatever problems there are don't recur. That's a bipartisan or nonpartisan solution that everybody, I think, ought to be behind.
Right, that
and if we can get past the voter wars, we'll be able to get there.
Right, maybe, but as you know, these voter laws are constitutional. Voter ID laws were held to be constitutional in 2008 in the Indiana case. It was a 6-3 decision, so you can't argue it was on partisan lines. So what the state of Florida is doing is perfectly reasonable and constitutional.
You're perhaps a little garbled or jumbled in what you're saying. We're not talking in this instance about voter ID laws, and that's the point, is that unfortunately Florida and other states are moving forward with every different kind of law they can come up with, it seems, to make it harder for people to vote. And so again, the League of Women Voters is a very respected and mainstream organization doing good work for years. I'm glad they may be in a position now legally to move forward with voter registration. We ought to be, the tragedy is that right now 4 out of 10 eligible voters in the state of Florida, eligible voters, are not registered to vote. What can we do to make that change?
Let me ask you this. It does seem that you're seeing the two parties break on, and that the Republicans simply want more rules in place to make it a little bit harder to register to vote and vote. Why?
Well, they want to make sure to get rid of voter fraud, and there have been examples of voter fraud in Florida.
I mean, it is
look
not
at ACORN.
Like this giant. We're talking about 100, 1 or 2 people here, 1 or 2 people, and we're not even 100% sure.
We just had a Michigan congressman resign and not run for re-election because he gathered signatures. His campaign gathered signatures that couldn't be validated.
But that's a case of petition signatures being valid. I mean, that's a different law here.
Yeah, but it's very hard to catch voter fraud. Look at what James O'Keefe did. He walked into D.C. He didn't have any ID. One of his guys video. No, he didn't vote. He didn't vote, but he asked for a ballot, and they were going to give it to him.
But you're actually proving the point here, that the fraud didn't take place because they prevented it.
But it's very hard to catch the fraud. That's why you have to do it before Election Day. If you try and do it in Election Day, you'll never catch any of the fraud.
Chuck, listen to the absurdity of that. It's so hard to find. It must be everywhere. So let's make laws that make it harder for millions to vote.
But why is it so bad to do it now? What's so wrong with the state of Florida taking corrective action before the election to try and prevent voter fraud? There's nothing wrong with that, and it's constitutional.
The problem is when you take actions that have a risk, more than a risk, of kicking out from the rolls eligible voters, veterans, people who've served the country. We ought to be able to make the elections secure without disenfranchising many, many Americans. And if we put aside the partisan gimmickry, we could do that.
This is a debate that's going to take place in 50 states, I think, and for a few years to come. Brian Darling, Michael Wellman, thank you both.